United Methodist Church. I am a cradle Methodist, just like, this one will be. I have the crib in my office to prove it if you want to check. I grew up in the United Methodist Church. Sunday mornings meant church, where I learned that Jesus lives inside all of our hearts, where I learned what it meant to grow up in a small town or small church. During high school, I served communion, read liturgy, and ran Sunday schools. I had adults in my life who showed me how faith is a way of life and how to walk along that way. I loved being a part of the United Methodist Church. But I have a confession. I know that's a Catholic thing, but I can still do it in the Methodist Church. If you were to ask 18-year-old Jen what it meant to be a United Methodist Church, I'm not sure how I would have answered. Yes, I went to confirmation, and I could tell you who John Wesley was, one of the founders of our faith, for those of you who may not have gone through confirmation yet. But I cannot tell you anything about his methodical understanding of grace. Yes, I could tell you that as United Methodists, we can believe vastly different things, but still be friends. But I couldn't tell you what those core beliefs surrounding our sacraments were. But then, when I intentionally thought to go deeper into my faith, into what it actually meant to be a United Methodist, I fell in love with the United Methodist Church all over again. There's so much depth to being United Methodist, the theology and the practice that I believe can help all people grow closer to God and grow closer to each other. I learned that as United Methodists, we are not afraid to wrestle with hard questions. The questions of life and the questions of faith, and how sometimes we discover there are no easy answers. And that's okay. I learned how we are not afraid to think about how our beliefs have ramifications in the real world. I was drawn to John Wesley's understanding of how the church interacts with the world, saying that there's no religion but social religion, no holiness but social holiness, and no holiness but social holiness. And then, of course, I came to learn and to love the 3 simple rules that make United Methodist Church. Y'all just learned them. Say them with me. Do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. For the next few weeks, we as a church will be diving deep into each one of these rules about John Wesley had for the United Methodists. We will discover what these simple rules are far more complex than they appear to be at first glance. These 3 simple rules are all dependent on each other, but the first provides a foundation for the other 2. Do no harm. Many of us, myself included, may think to ourselves, well, duh, that seems obvious, do no harm. I'm pretty sure when I was 18, I probably would have said that too. The United Methodist Church also does not have a monopoly on this philosophy. Doctors say it as part of their oath. Heck, even the 3M brand company has do no harm and promise that they won't hurt your walls when you put the picture up and take it down, or all your Christmas decorations or Halloween decorations. Your walls will be safe. They'll do no harm. This seems like a no-brainer. All we have to do is not cause harm to anything or anyone, and we're good to go. But as the people called Methodists, we are not settled with that. We know we must go deeper and to see how that rule can affect our everyday lives. In order for this to happen, we have to ask ourselves some hard and difficult questions. What are the ways we have intentionally or unintentionally done harm? This is a difficult question that challenges us to examine the corners of our hearts And fortunately for us, the Bible is full of stories that show us how to wrestle with difficult questions like this one. The prophet Micah called the people of Israel to ask difficult questions and challenged them to do the hard work of self-reflection. Long before Micah's ministry, the people of Israel developed a system of sacrifices to help them become closer to God. If they committed sin, then they would just make the appropriate sacrifice as a way to re-enter a right relationship with God. But over time, they had fallen into a sacrifice routine and no longer did the difficult work of internal reflection that led to transformation. Instead, they thought that because they believed in God and did all of the things that were required of them, it didn't matter what they did. The Israelites thought that they could disobey God's commandments and everything would be okay as long as they made the appropriate offering. They could bring calves or rams to appease God's anger. They could pour out costly oils as a gift to God. They would even be willing to sacrifice their firstborn. I don't think I could do that. If it came to that. Whatever it took, they would give it in hopes of winning God's favor. What they failed to see was those offerings did not matter to God. Those offerings were unintentionally doing harm. Because instead of building relationship with God, they served as barriers for the Israelites to receive God's grace. God did not need their sacrifices. God did not care about their rituals, and God was more concerned with how they were living their lives. God was concerned with what kind of people they were to be. The Israelites had forgotten that they were a people of grace, and grace is meant to be shared. They had forgotten that grace is the greatest gift of all. They couldn't claim to be people of God in worship, while the rest of the week they did not stand up for justice. They could not fully experience grace while treating others without kindness. And they could not walk humbly with God if they were too focused on themselves. God did not turn away from the Israelites. Instead, God spoke through the prophet Micah to offer the Israelites a way to reconnect to God. Micah is reminding them that God is a God of grace, and God's grace is freely given to help us all grow closer to God. Because the people of Israel stopped to reflect on it, they knew what they wanted. They knew what God wanted. And so Micah reminded them, do justice, love, kindness, walk humbly with your God. With this prophet's reminder, the Israelites reflected on their internal motivations. They had to reflect on the ways in which their lives did not reflect God's values. In doing so, they had the opportunity to grow deeper with God and with each other. Now, I can't imagine that once the Israelites heard Micah's command, they instantly became people of self-reflection and transformed their hearts, and they did all the love and the justice and the kindness and all that stuff. They had to be willing to do the hard work, to dig deeper into what motivated them to forget in the first place. They had to do the hard work of asking, what does it mean to seek justice? They had to do the hard work of genuinely living with kindness. They had to do the hard work of humbling themselves, walking where God would lead. Through all that self-reflection and hard work and difficult life changes that had to happen and the hard conversations, God's grace was with them. Whether they chose to act, whether they took a stand, whether they took a risk to stand up for justice, God's grace was with them. Whether they chose to act with kindness, God's grace was with them. As they humbled themselves, giving up pride and selfishness, God's grace was with them. That same grace is offered to us today. God is always offering us grace to do no harm. God is always supplying us with the grace we need to work on that self-reflection. God's grace is what allows us to see fully the dignity and worth within all creation, including within ourselves. All we have to do is recognize that the grace is around us and within us. When we do that, that can lead to a transformed heart, which will allow God's grace to work through us so we can do no harm and do what is required of us. We know what we need to do. When we accept God's grace, it empowers us to move past our own shortcomings so that we can do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with our God. So that brings us back to our first simple rule: do no harm. As we can see, it's simple to remember, but it's deeper than it appears. To do no harm means we start with ourselves. We take a good look at those hidden corners of our hearts, those places we may not want to admit exist because of what we might find there. We might find that we have committed harm in the past. In those corners, we might find a time when we failed to extend forgiveness, or a time when we judged someone before we got to know them, or a time when we talked about someone behind their backs, or a time when we lost our cool and acted out of anger, or maybe a time when we shut people out instead of letting them in. We might even discover a time when we did nothing, when we should have done something. And once we acknowledge what's hiding in the corners of our hearts, grace gives us the opportunity to go even deeper, to acknowledge our motivations for having those hidden corners in the first place. We might discover apathy, prejudice, or selfishness. It isn't always easy, but the internal reflection is vital to living a life of doing no harm. Because when we choose to live an unexamined life, we are choosing to perpetuate harm. Like the prophet Micah, we must be vulnerable so that we can open our hearts to God's transforming grace. I know being vulnerable can be risky business. What if we find out something about ourselves we might not like? The promise God makes us is that we do not take that risk alone. God's transforming grace is always with us, whether we know it or not. This discernment is necessary so that we may do no harm. As people of faith, as United Methodists, we can trust that God's grace will work within us and in the midst of our self-reflection, so that God can transform our hearts. Living with no harm means that we do justice by protecting the vulnerable and seeking to alleviate all forms of suffering and injustice. We can live a life of no harm when we love kindness by building communities in such a way that empower and embrace diversity. When we do no harm, walking humbly with God, we are able to bring about God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. When we do no harm, we choose empathy, understanding, acceptance, generosity, peace, and community. When we do no harm, we acknowledge and honor each other as a person, as a child of God, born with dignity and born with sacred worth. When we do no harm, we can do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with our God. That is what God requires of us, and that